So let's talk about some more interface things for iOS. So here on the Apple developer website, I'm on the Human Interface Guidelines. If you simply Google search Apple Human Interface Guidelines, you'll find this page. And on the left-hand side, there's a bunch of different areas. And basically, these are the guidelines from Apple for different designs for their apps for iOS, for macOS, for iPad, etc. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to go down to Visual Design. I'm just going to go to Adaptivity and Layout. And in Adaptivity and Layout, we can see different screen sizes, how we should lay things out, their recommendations for considerations like where navigation should go, how large it should be, space it should take up. We can go to the Animation tab and see the same thing about animations. Different terms that they're using, whether you should have dark mode or not, which basically, yes, you should have dark mode. If we go to the Icons and Images tab, we can see different image resolution requirements and things like that. So this is a really, really cool website where we can go through and find different pages about different topics like typography and stuff like that, and then apply those into our design. So I just wanted to mention that. I'll have a link to that in the notes. But in here, I'm going to go to XD, and we're going to actually build an element that we're going to bring into Xcode and use as a button in Xcode. So the first thing I want to do is determine the size of my XD project. So I'm going to go with an XR because that's what I'm using right now for this project. And it's going to just quickly build this and save it. And what I'm going to do is make a really simple button. So I'm going to take a rectangle. I'm going to go pretty large with this one, add some nice rounded corners. I will center it. And I'm not going to worry about text in here. I could use text as a design element just to kind of plan out how the text is going to fit. But really, I will do that just for the sake of this video. So let's get a nice fill on this. Let's do something in let's do like this, kind of an aqua thing. I'm going to do no border. We'll do a small shadow, because why not? All right, so there's the start of our button. Let's add some text just to see how it looks. So we'll say placeholder text. Now I can play with that. By default, this uses SF, which I actually don't know if I have installed right now. Yeah, I do. So SF is the font that the Xcode uses or iOS apps use. So let's do compact display. We'll go with something like 35. And let me just recenter that. Okay. So that looks pretty good. So just like before, we can design all of our elements in XD. Let's talk about how we actually bring them into Xcode for use. So I'm going to select this, and I like to make things symbols ahead of time, or make them a component. Sorry, they changed the name recently. So I'm going to make that a component, and in my components list, I can see I have this component right here, and I can give it a name. I'll call it large button. And I will hit the mark for export button right here. I can also do that by right-clicking and saying mark for export. And what we can do at this point, once we have everything sort of marked for export, we can go File, Export, Batch. And that will export everything that we have. I'm going to say export for iOS. And I'm just going to put this out on my desktop. PNG is fine. That's what I want to use. And I'm going to say I designed it at, and that's the size that I designed it at. So this is important for certain UIs. For instance, if I'm designing for an iPad, then I might be using like a 3x or a 2x design. It basically is, it kind of has to deal with how Retina displays work. But I'm just going to leave this at 1x for now and say export. And what's going to happen is it's going to generate 3 buttons for me, 3 images. And each image is basically different sizes. So we start with the 1x, the one that we actually made, and then a 2x, and then a 3x. So again, this is just what iOS uses. It uses this 3x system, and I'll get into how to use that in just a little bit. As for the text, let's say I really like this text, I can actually make this a component as well. And if I make this a component, it just turns it into an image to save. But if I add it to the assets, such as adding my color to assets and adding the character style to assets, which is what I want here, the color I don't really care about, but the font and so on. So I'm going to say add character style to assets. And what that does is actually shows me in the assets menu, which is this top one right here, the character style, and that character style gives me all the information I need to know about. So it is SF compact display, line spacing 41, 35 point, and we're good to go. This technically could be exported through a program called Zeppelin, which we'll use a little bit later. But what's important is that we can save all of these things. So let's say I made like a couple different mock-ups of this. Let's just duplicate this. And I will change it to be like maybe 45. And instead of SF compact display, let's do something like, I don't know, Sathu. If I right-click, add that character style, I'm going to have another one right here that I can look at. And I can click back and forth between these easily. So this is another way that I can almost like export these and find the values for these different fonts that I'm using within Xcode later. So let's go ahead and go back to Xcode now. And within Xcode, I have my kind of bad project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import those elements into my assets.xc assets folder. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. One is I can right-click and say import, which is what I'm going to do here. And then on my desktop, I'm going to just select that first button. So that comes in, and what we see is we actually see the button on the left-hand side, the name of it, and then we have the 1x, the 2x, and the 3x, just like we thought. So we can actually just drag and drop those in if we like. So there's my 2x, and there's my 3x, and then whenever we do some like adaptive scaling later, it'll just understand, okay, this is the same asset at different sizes. All right, so we have these three images imported. We're good to go. Let's go back to our main storyboard, and now let's build a button with this. So if I add a button, drag and drop, and I go to its attributes editor, I can change the image right here to be the large button image. And whenever I hit that, it's going to do this kind of funky thing where the text gets pushed over. And that's because it's trying to add an image to the actual content of my button. So let's change that back to none. And instead, let's change the background image. See, whenever I change the background image, it actually puts that image behind the button, and that becomes a part of the button. If I resize it, it is going to skew it, so I don't want to really mess with the resizing. So I don't want to resize these ever, I just want to leave it how it is. It's going to come in at the right size, so this is how I designed it. If I go back to XD, it's the same size. There it is in here. So now let's work on that font and that color. So I'm going to hit that font button. Let's change it to custom, and I'll go find, what was it that we used? It's like Sathul or something. Well, it's actually not listed in here. Let's use, well here, let's stick it on system, which is SF. And we'll just change the size to match the right size, which was 35. Okay, and now let's get the color right. All right, so our button looks correct now, and it's come in correctly from XD.